colored by subjectivity. And if it seems on later view to be less than fully correct, it truly is a reminiscence of the situation as we remembered it. We realize that our memories are strongly biased by the thoughts we had at the time. Just a word here about what this all was. Here's our favorite spacecraft, and the astronaut is shown out of his couch standing up in a navigational position. He is supposedly able to look through some optical instruments there, which he can use to the way you use a sextant for navigation. And right next to him he has the display and keyboard, which is this thing right here, for talking with the computer. There are some other buttons in front of him. And the computer itself, that's, by the way, the two pieces of it are standing here if you haven't already noticed. Looks like that put together, and it was located in an equipment bay down here. So this is essentially, this was the culmination of what we're going to talk about. The long story, starting back in the late 50s with the Polaris, the first Polaris guidance computer that was designed by Eldon Hall. Return with us now to 1959. Imagine yourself a computer designer in 1959. What goes through your mind? Avoid transistors. They barely work. When they do work, they consume vast amounts of power for their short lifetime. Magnetics, on the other hand, which had been used in various ways in computer design at that time, were very large. As a matter of fact, a gentleman by the name of Maurice Carnot, who is celebrated for something called a Carnot map that logicians use, once made the remark that whereas thin films operated in what we call now nanoseconds, which he called then light feet, that's the amount of time it takes light to travel 1 foot, he said that conventional magnetics were more like heavy boots, which indeed they were. In the spacecraft business, size and weight were fearful problems. And of these two, since both were bad, magnetics were the lesser, because not only did transistors burn up a lot of power that required a lot of batteries, and batteries, of course, are made of lead, but they also required other things to take the heat generated by all that and blow it away. Well, anyway, there we were. Polaris had really broken the ice as far as spacecraft computers go. It was a very small, powerful machine, beautifully packaged. So Ramon and I inherited that tradition. And I should say that an intermediate thing I had nothing to do with, Ramon and Halcombe Lanning put together a Mars mission concept, a little computer the size of a grapefruit that would operate on a dime and a piece of lemon juice or something like that. All right. And would go to Mars and come back and snap a picture, but it never did. Never built it. That led to the first Apollo concept when MIT remarkably got the computer design contract for Apollo. The Apollo Concept 1 was a magnetic core logic machine, which was nice. It didn't consume much power. It was just huge. That was challenged by Concept 2, which was a logical emulation of it made with integrated circuits, which of course don't work. And then when we adopted integrated circuits, which still didn't work, we made some flight models of the Apollo Block 1 computer. Strangely, they worked. And Block 1B was the same thing, except that it was hermetically sealed because we decided that the astronauts were not going to change modules up in space. And then Block 2, the one that I showed before, the one that finally was used on all the manned flights, which we'll say more about. Well, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to cover about 10 years in time, and there was this learning that went on as we moved from one Stone Age to a Bronze Age, kind of in computer history. I want to introduce Ramon at this point, who attended a meeting at one point very early in the game.
The nature of our talk is to remember things said by wise men and fools, famous people and not so famous people, and put them in the context of how we perceive this whole design going. It's interesting how one can collect the right information from the past. What was happening at the time was that Albert and I had come from what was basically a computer shop. There weren't too many in those days, and Instrumentation Laboratory, as the place was then known, was really oriented towards flight and airplanes. And this comment was prompted by a proposal or a block diagram that we had put up on the board showing how the Apollo guidance computer would interact with all the things it had to measure and control. And there weren't any dials. None. There were going to be nothing but numbers displayed somewhere. And the man who made this comment, who was a very experienced systems engineer who had had a lot of experience with aircraft and the kind of things that pilots want, said, that's silly. Of course you've got to have dials. How can you not have dials if it's in an aircraft like that? So that was, there's kind of East meets West in technology. And there was a lot of this kind of feeling about how systems should be put together, and a lot of vacuums to fill. So that was a good meeting, just about, must be the first 3 months of starting to talk about Apollo. And now, anybody who gives me a need to know, I'll tell them who that person was. The next thing that happened, as I recall it, was a perfect example of top-down design in which the requirements are set, and what the actual job is carefully described, and then you see what you need to do in order to accomplish the job. The first thing that got decided was how big it was going to be. And as I recall, Eldon Hall and Ned Duggan went to North American Aviation and came back saying, it's this big. And that's what it was. Whatever it was that we were going to do was going to fit in that hole. So, it's a little bit like watching stories about the National Basketball Association, and some famous rookie goes in there and he gets thrown all over the place, and some wise old veteran says, welcome to the NBA, rookie. That was the feeling that we had about all of the nice things that we learned about how you first size a job and really tell what it is that you have to do. That was it. We're going to fill it with computer, and we hoped that it would do the job on it. So that was interesting. We, of course, had no trouble with that. We knew all the solutions already. Then came a little bit more of what is now known as reality testing. As we started proposing various things, we got to meet astronauts, and especially the ones that came with the Mercury. And they listened to what we had to say, and then they told us, sometimes politely, sometimes not so politely, that the first thing they'd do was indeed going to turn it off. First place, nobody was going to fly their airplane. In the second place, they didn't trust it. In the third place, whatever. And so that was a very interesting thing. It's I don't know how many times we heard that. It was good. So we had to, I can't say we had to fight it. I don't think that but certainly we had to wear it down. We had to do something with time. But people get used to everything, including computers and spacecraft. Okay, then finally we get down to work. And this story has to do with one of the better examples of how things should be done inside of an organization. The scenario is this. There were two competing technologies for measuring angles. One was called analog, one was called digital. It doesn't matter what they were, but behind the two competing technologies were two competing individuals, and they each had a group underneath them. The assumption was that the competing technology that won would get the plum and get the job. They would get to do the fun part, do this thing. And the two individuals were jousting politely and without coming out and fighting. That wasn't nice to do, but it was clear what was going on. And I remember a meeting in finally the evidence begins to accumulate, and I forget, I think it was the analog method was better. That is, the analog method began to look more and more reasonable to do. And so I saw the man who was presumably on the losing side stand up at a meeting one time and said to the other man, "Harry, your idea is better, it's clearly the way to go, and we'll do it." Whereupon Harry was left with nothing to say, you know. So there he was, and he lost it. That was a great lesson, I thought. I think that it's fair to say that in all large enterprises like Apollo, there were lots and lots and lots and lots of these fights. You don't never hear about these because there were no clear winners and losers, but there was a lot of jousting for position, a lot of trying to set up within an organization from competing organizations, and we'll have stories about that too. And they make for good storytelling after the fact on that. So on that. Okay, now we come to the one of the more interesting, some people say bizarre, aspects of the Apollo design, and that is the business of how the memory was going to be made, the one that held the program. At the time, there were a lot of cross-kinds going through. There were certain things which were known. It was known how to store variables, to keep information that you could read and write that you could change. It was believed that computer structures had to be of a kind in which everything was put in one structure, in one kind of memory, although there were dissenting views. But generally, nobody knew how to put enough information in a small enough space. We didn't either, as a matter of fact, but we thought we did. And so we proposed a scheme that we read a paper from some fellows that had done some work on the technique, which I'll describe in a minute. And we proposed it and began to work. And I can remember, Eldon, a meeting in which finally, we had to make up our minds whether we're going to use this or not. And I remember the look of resignation that you had when you said, "I guess we've got to go." We didn't know what else to do, as I recall, and there were no alternatives. But all turned out well and all that. But here's the principle of the thing. What we wanted to do was store information in a way in which it could not be changed. Now, this is good news and bad news. If you're an astronaut and you're flying and the information is going to fly your airplane can't change, that's good news. If you were a programmer trying to write programs to do these tasks, that's very bad news. At least it was then, because it was simply inconceivable to people who wrote programs back in the early 60s that you simply could not change the program anytime you want. Now, there's kind of a theological or a business behind it, in the sense there were two schools of computer design at the time. One was the von Neumann school. John von Neumann of Princeton had the absolutely amazing insight that you could mix programs with data in the same memory because you could then alter the instructions. And this was thought to be a very, very powerful thing. And it was. It was like, my God, I never realized that before. And this really grabbed a hold of the imagination of all the professionals in the field at the time. At the same time, the person from whose shop we came, Howard Aiken, had proposed something called separate storage, in which case, under which the instructions were in one kind of memory and the data that the instructions operated on were in another kind of memory. Okay, so these were the two schools of thought in the late 50s as to how you should build computers. And by the time that we were designing the Apollo computer, the common storage, the von Neumann approach, was clearly hands down the winner, because anybody with any brains knew that that was fundamentally more flexible and more powerful than to have it as separate storage. Now, here we were, and for reasons of necessity, not for reasons of dogma, we were proposing again going back to this separate storage technique. And the idea is this: these cores, and I'll show you what a core looks like, little donuts, about maybe 1/4 of an inch wide, were set up so that you had a series of wires going through, and the information that these cores contained was determined by whether the wires went through or did not go through the cores themselves. One bunch of wires served the purpose of selecting which of these cores was going to be active. The other bunch of wires actually contained the information. Now, the appeal of this technique was that the amount of information you could store per core was a function of how many wires you could potentially push through the hole. And that was very good. That is much, much denser than any other technique that we knew about at the time. And it might even work. Okay. Now, I have somewhere I have an example. This is not a flight piece of hardware or anything like that. It was just a breadboard. But I'll see if I can show you what a core looked like there. You can see the size of the donut in comparison with my finger, and you can see the wires going through it. Okay. Now, this is first of all, the way we thought about this, the cores, as in this particular little breadboard, are all coaxial. That is, the cores are one after the other, and somehow the job at hand was how the devil were we going to pass a needle or something through in order to make this memory. We weren't sure. We had lots of ideas, and a great deal of money was spent trying to make memories that way. But none of them were very satisfactory. And remember that, just to go back to this, the nature of the wires that went through the holes or didn't go through the holes was something which was determined by the program writers, so that it wasn't a pattern that was going to stay put. At some point, you're going to get very complicated instructions of what wires were going to go through and what wires were not going to go through. So there we were worrying about how could you knit or sew through these various donuts and put the information in. And a very smart man called Sam Francis had what I consider one of, so nice, so clever. He turned the problem upside down, and he said, the problem is that you've got all these donuts in a line. And so you're trying to push a needle, and maybe there's no room for the needle to go in and out. And it's very difficult. And so that either you have to put the cores very far apart, in which case you can't make a memory that's tight enough or dense enough, or something. So you couldn't really do it that way. So what this man proposed was to do it by putting all the magnetic cores, I better draw it. Well, by putting the magnetic cores not where the axis, so that the holes went like that, but putting them all in one plane. So that, I'll show you a better one here. I wanted to show this slide last because of its effect, but you see what the cores are. The cores are rather than coaxial, they're coplanar. Okay, and then he said, now when they're coplanar, you can use some instruments such as this one, in which an operator can pass a needle back and forth under control of a tape mechanism, and it can then the operator doesn't have to decide where it goes through. The tape does that. But now it's possible because the hole itself is available to the operator to pass a needle through. So here's kind of an interesting thing between putting the things coaxially and putting in coplanar, which we simply had not thought about. And it worked. This one really worked, and it was possible to make these read-only memories. Many were made, and these are the kind that flew. Now,
let me just horn in on this, that it was actually a remarkable mechanical engineering job done after San Francisco by Bill Zantel of Raytheon, who was actually able to take these things and squeeze them down into small modules and set up a manufacturing process whereby probably between 1 and 200 modules were made, each one with a different program in it, over the life of the Apollo program. Truly an unsung hero.
On this one. Now, this picture used to give heart attacks to the people concerned with reliability. The whole idea of wires that are so randomly going through the various holes that obviously interfere with each other it's very difficult to achieve true regularity, since the information itself was very irregular. And so that was one of these circumstances that the good news is that it worked. The bad news is that we don't quite sure why on it. See, it looks very different when you see the finished product. It looks very neat on it, but when you take a microscope to it, it's not. I might make another point about this. When we first proposed this type of memory, the people who were concerned about writing programs for the Apollo computer honestly did not believe that this is what we were going to do. They said, well, maybe you'll think of something, the right thing to do, but at the time, the idea that you had to write programs that you could not change, never mind at the last minute, but not for 6 months before flight time, was just not considered grown up. Now, this turned out to have had unexpected but great side effects. I think a whole lot of the discipline of software writing came about because you became clear as time went on that you really had to write programs that were very well tested and very well understood, that you could not rush up to the launching pad and the last minute says, whoops, we'd like to make a little change here. There were other projects that did just that and paid the consequence. And there are today projects that do just that and pay the consequence. So that was kind of an interesting thing in which some goodness came out of what is fundamentally a difficult piece of reality to live with on that. So, well, now I'm going to quote. The thing that happened also is that over the time in which the Apollo project was developed, our very first estimate of how much memory we needed was 4,000 words. The very first. I see some smiles in the audience. The latest estimate that I remember was at least twice what was really there, which wound up being 36,000 words. So that, and this is classical in every project that I've known, every computer that has been built has gone through this, in which the job is estimated as needing so much, and then it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. So this prompted a man that worked with us, and is not here, unfortunately, to make a statement which I quote, which is that you can do so much with 4K and so little with 40. Because somehow you could get the thing going with a small memory. You could get the gist of what we were trying to do with 4K words, in this case. But by the time you really had to do it right, 40K was not enough. So that was quite an insight into the nature of computers and at least in living systems. So, okay, that does the read-only memory. One last thing. The read-only memory concept, well, that was probably the first use of read-only memory in the modern sense. There were little examples, but the idea of using a lot of information that could only be read and not written into was, I think, unique, or at least not practiced widely at that time. Today, every Atari game has one of those, but that's different. And also the fact that we have to go back to this separate storage technique was interesting to us. And so I'm going to quote a man who had nothing to do with the Apollo project. This man is successfully, he's a friend of mine, he successfully has resisted coming to the 20th century. He believes that Apollo is a Greek god. And so he said that things have come full helix, in the sense that depending on how you look at them, either they're just the way they were before, or else if you look at the helix the other way, you're not exactly the same place but somewhere else. So I think that this accurately describes the idea of you going from common storage to separate storage to common storage to separate storage. And we'll go back again, I'm sure. Okay. Now we come to some more technical details which have to do with how should you pick the word size inside of a computer. Robert?
We're trying to resist the temptation to talk about the detailed architecture of the machine, but it's really just too delicious to pass up. The Apollo guidance computer was made with 15 bits. Now, some people in the audience will know that that's a strange sounding number. Computer should be made with 16, 32, 64, maybe 24, but that's a little peculiar. 15. Well, it was perfectly reasonable. I mean, better 15 than 12 is all I could say. We were trying to compact things down in a small box, and we figured that bits in a word counted against you. So you use just as few of them as you possibly could. And boy, you can really use few bits if you put your mind to it. Well, we were really being kind of lavish with 15 bits because that meant that a single number or word, which gives us this kind of granularity of 2 to the minus 15th power, and you take a full circle, and that fraction corresponds to 40 seconds of arc, which is about right for the granularity of our optical instruments and our inertial guidance instruments. So that was just fine. No need to go to a longer word. Well, needless to say, there was a little bit of irony in this because we paid over and over and over again for that folly. Not so much that it was 15, but for the fact that it wasn't at least 18 or 19 or 20. And we got caught in exactly the same bind that every generation of computer thus far, with the possible exception of the most modern generation, and the jury isn't in on that yet, that the words are too short. Now, moreover, why an odd number of bits in a word? In other words, if we hadn't had 15 bits, we probably would have gone to 17 or 19, which sounds even crazier. And the reason why you had an odd number of bits in the word was that we were very concerned about detecting malfunctions. And if you have a malfunction, particularly in a memory, what might happen is that the word will come out with all zeros. So you want to be able to spot that as being wrong. However, there's another kind of malfunction that'll bring out all ones. You want to be able to spot that as all wrong. So we say, aha, we'll fix it so an even number of bits will be in the word plus its parity extra bit. That meant an even number of bits, including the parity bit, which meant an odd number of information bits, because, of course, you only have one parity bit, of course. So that's how we got to that absurd conclusion, and we wrote a paper in which we, I think, preached that gospel, along with some other gospels that are very funny, like, for example, using what's called a ones complement number system with two representations of 0. Sounds reasonable. I mean, after all, there are 32,768 different numbers we could represent. So why not just give up one of those for an extra representation of 0? Well, stay tuned. I'll be back in a while to tell you a little about that. In the meantime, Ramon has got to tell a great story.
Oh, all right. This is one of the things that happened along the way. As we were talking about jurisdictional disputes, one of the things that was never resolved from the point of view of who was going to do what, was the question of the displays that the astronauts were going to look at. There were a lot of people who had various interests. There was a human factors group that was interested in things such as how big the buttons had to be, because the astronauts will be wearing these enormously cumbersome gloves, and so the buttons had to be of a certain size. And the fact that the letters that they had to look at or numbers that they had to read had to be of a certain size, because they'd be in brightness, because they had to look through clumsy spacesuits and all kinds of things of that sort. So there were a lot of restrictions as to what it was that the astronauts could or could not do. At the same time, one group that was interested in fairly advanced ideas of displays was still dreaming that you could have what today is commonplace, namely a cathode ray tube, that you could have text, that you could have all kinds of things like that. So for a while, nothing very much happened in the way of displays, and there was some need for an interim sort of approach for us. There was a way in the computer design group. So one day, coming to work, it occurred to me that one straightforward thing to do was to arrange for displaying a set of numbers, and I'll tell you exactly what my reasoning was. You can see maybe I can have a slide. The reasoning was something of the sort. The number 3 is important in space because you show coordinates by 3 numbers, you show vectors by 3 numbers, you show velocity by sets of 3 numbers. So the fact that there should be a set of 3 numbers which would appear here, you can see them very faintly as all 8s. Okay? Those sets of 3 numbers, it made sense that there should be 3. It didn't make sense that it should be 2, and there wasn't any good reason why there should be 4 that I could think of. Not that so 3 was the thing. Now the other thing was that how should these numbers be organized? And it occurred to me that verbs and nouns would be good because verb is an action and noun is the object of the action, and because computer jargon pretty much goes along that way. And with verbs and nouns, numerical verbs and nouns, you could say align rocket, display time, fire rocket. So you could use the same nouns with the same verbs, and it kind of makes a pigeon sense out of the whole thing. So we did that. We did that because we had no way of showing to visiting firemen that we had a working computer. That was an important reason. And, we kind of had to do something while the powers that be decided what the proper display was going to be. Well, we built some, and then we began to show off the computer, and then we began to notice something very interesting. As visitors would come, they would come and say, well, that's very interesting, and we'd tell them about display time, and we, verb 65 display, and noun 32 display time, or whatever it was. And there'd be a silence, and you say, about this verb and noun, do you mean to leave it that way? Well, why not? Well, there was a pause usually, and then there'd be something such as, don't you think it's a little informal? No. But, it's not very scientific. Well, not everybody would say this, but it began to accumulate. People would come, and then it began to be a game. And the minute we began to spot, somebody would say, well, are you going to leave this verb and noun renewal was in the back? And so we began to collect the various reasons why they gave, why one should not have verbs and nouns. And this, mind you, the people who would bring this up were not whom you'd expect to bring this up. And the collection of reasons were, it's not very scientific. It's not very military. It's not very professional. Okay, it's not very space-like. By this time it was wonderful. Somebody would come, and then the game got more elaborate, and we'd explain that the reason for the verb and the noun was because we had to have, the size of these letters was dictated by the human factors people. It had to be certain size, and what would you suggest if not verb and noun? I don't know. Tell me something. What would you like? Action. Action's okay. We could fit it. How about noun? Object of the action? That gets a little long. Won't fit. So yeah. And it was wonderful. Everybody, of course, would be buffaloed. And so finally, the last time that I remember, a very senior man who came and was given the whole thing, by that time it was a very slick presentation, with very slick baiting for this whole approach, was the man who finally went back to a corner, completely gave me this as a final reason why we had to change it. He didn't know to what, but we had to change it. And that's because he was for sure that the astronauts would not understand what verbs and nouns meant. So I think that's the end of that story. Okay, Albert. Now we go back to other.
One of our visitors, I just remembered, shortly after the working model of the display and keyboard was available to us, was Carl Sagan. He was associated, I think, with the Smithsonian in those days. He was interested in space. However, I think most of his contacts were with JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And whether deserved or not, JPL used to have the reputation on the East Coast of being using obsolete technology. And Sagan came, he looked at this thing, and said, I've often heard about these things, but I've never seen one. I'm not sure what he meant, whether he meant digital computer or something far out in the future. Okay, back to technical stuff. Remember 1959, transistors are undependable and no good. The bright light in that was what I think Eldon Hall was able to accomplish in the Polaris program. He twisted Fairchild's tail until they came out with reliable planar silicon transistors that really kind of led the way into the integrated circuit age. So Eldon had a very positive feeling, well, not very positive, but positive enough so at least he felt that we had to try them out. He also correctly deduced that unless we had integrated circuits in that machine, somebody would come up 6 months later and have us thrown out of the spacecraft. He was absolutely right about that. We were almost thrown out anyway. So after a civil war and a lot of struggle, we capitulated. We said, Eldon, you're absolutely right. We want to use integrated circuits, and we'll do it. So we did it. Actually, Herb Thaler did it. But we remained associated with the project at any rate. Well, we were just absolutely wrong. We had gone in with the idea we had to use magnetics, and we were committed to it. It became a dogma with us, and we were absolutely bent out of shape when the decision, and we understood the rationale for the decision, we even agreed with it. But so we sort of bit our lips and went on and said, okay, it's going to be an integrated circuit machine. And from then on, you couldn't find anybody who was more a champion of integrated circuits than we were. I mean, we knew how to jump on the bandwagon even then. Here's an example of, it's not the first, this is sort of the second generation integrated circuit that we used. It's two 3-input NOR gates on the same chip, I think. Is that right, Eldon? Yeah. You look at 2 gates on a chip. Now today, when you go out and you buy something that's very contemporary, the number must be 100,000 or 100,000 transistors or something. I mean, but the order of magnitude is so far ahead. And it's often said that the doubling of density on integrated circuits happens about every 2.5 years or so. And it's, as far as we can tell, that's exactly accurate. But this is the way it was very early. And even with these absolutely cumbersome dimensions by today's standards, there were reliability problems, and it's to the great credit of people who worked in reliability engineering, both at Raytheon and at MIT in those days, that these circuits came out with the reliability far exceeding the reliability of any semiconductor, virtually any semiconductor circuit that was ever produced before or since. It had to do with the fact that this was the only type of device that was used for logic in the whole computer. There were 2,700 of these chips that went in, packaged into that cubic foot. In fact, into half of this thing. On one of these trays, there are packaged 2,700 of these things. And so building 100 or so computers meant buying 27,000 just for production, not to mention the ones that were bought for testing. So there were vast numbers of integrated circuits bought and tested, and as you can imagine, that kind of thing tends to lead to reliable production. The computer had a mean time between failure that was estimated on the basis of its ultimate performance at something like $70,000, which was very remarkable. That's another, I think it's another version of the same thing, but I'm not sure. Let me whisk it off before I get too embarrassed. Back to the back to some of this number system business, which I said was truly fascinating. Here's another little piece of doggerel if you read it with rhythm. 2 to the 15th power minus 1. Now the significance of that is that our words had 15 bits and should have stored 2 to the 15th power different states, but remember that we had 2 representations of 0, so that meant that the number of states was 2 to the 15th minus 1, the 32,767. Now, that would have been okay, except for one little problem. There were some mechanical things that used to have to go around in a circle. And these were like the inertial measurement unit and this telescope and sextant kind of stuff. All of those mechanical things had to move, and we had to know where they were, so there were little measuring instruments on them. And the mechanical design groups were told that we had 15 bits in a word, and that meant 40 seconds of arc, and they said, fine. And they went and they devised the gear trains that when one of these things went around full circle and came back to its index point, it would have generated 32,768 little impulses that we could have counted. And it wasn't until after we were well down the pike and had the computer essentially designed and built, and they had their gear trains designed and built, that we noticed this funny thing, that every time that the gimbals went around a complete circle, we got 1 digit off. And go around and once again get 2 digits off. Why is that? Well, finally figured it out. And so what do you do about this? I mean, as a computer logic designer, you're facing the following choice. Do I make a trivial change in the computer logic and thereby ruin its purity? Or do I go to the mechanical designer and see if he can change the gear train? Well, I did the right thing. First of all, you've got to worry about this kind of a situation because there are a lot of numbers of the form 2 to the something minus 1 that are prime numbers that are not divisible, called Mersenne primes, right? Well, we looked up in the table and we found happily this wasn't a Mersenne prime. it actually is divisible into these three things. Aha, you could make a gear train that way. So we went to the mechanical design people, and I remember, completely straight-faced, and I actually seriously suggested to this guy, why don't you redesign the gear train? Here are the factors that you need. And the look on his face was classic. One wishes one could have portrayed it. What we wound up doing was making the trivial logical change.
Now, I'd like to add something to this point, and that's that you may think that we were callow, inexperienced, blundering youths doing this kind of thing. No, we weren't. We were well over 30 years old at the time.
Now, it looks like this has already been said, but
Well, this is the kind of thing that gets you sued, but we'll go through with it anyway. There were a lot of famous visitors that came by, and on the whole, either interested or encouraging or neutral. There was one man, Robert Fano, who's a very famous theoretical computer sciences professor who was marvelous. But he came and he just bought right into it, and he was offering all kinds of suggestions, none of them practical, but that didn't matter. The guy really, his heart was in it, and so it was very nice to talk to him. But there was another man who was also a famous computer pioneer, whom I think his character can be described by the fact that a lot of us refer to him as your arrogance. And and this man came and took a look at what we were doing, and he just said flat out, "No way, it's not going to work." Now, I'm happy to say that he has also predicted that the world would be awash in garbage by this time, and has made a lot of predictions like that. But I remember that man coming and ruining my day with his attitude at that time. So, there's little things that happen along the way. Now, point another one of the kind. At one point, things didn't go quite right, and so a watchdog agency was created, or not created, was brought in to oversee what we were doing. And the name of the agency was Bellcom. It was a derivative of Bell Laboratories, but it was independent. And this story has to do with what in a name. Let me show you a little bit of technology here, but not much, I hope. There are two ways in which we could ingest into the computer the business about angles, about how we would measure angles. One way, the one we chose, was to do something which interrupted the computer for one memory cycle time and added a 1 or subtracted a 1 from a register, and that would increment the angle by 1 or subtract it by 1. And that used very little equipment, but you had to interrupt it by one cycle. And there were perhaps, I don't know, of the order of 16 different angle or angle-like quantities that we had to do this to. The other approach was to provide a fair amount of gear, not gear in the same sense as a mechanical gear, but equipment that would do all this job and would not cost that extra cycle that we're talking about. And the size of these boxes represents our subjective estimate before the fact as to how much it would take to do the job one way versus the other. Now, the good news here was that it didn't take very much more equipment or circuits. The bad news was that you lost a cycle every so often. How many cycles you lost and how bad that was depended on how much activity there was with all of these interruptions that would come and cause the angles to be incremented. Now, the thing that in retrospect is amusing is how we used to call it positive increment and negative increment. And these people came and said, "You're cycle stealing." What? I'm an honest person, I pay my taxes. What do you mean you're cycle stealing? You are, you know, so you're taking cycles away from what the computer ought to be doing, which is computing, and you're cycle stealing. And I remember feeling positively attacked by this thing, and I think to speak for Albert as well, that we're doing it. Now, I think it took about a year before we came down from our high horse and said, well, all right, so we're cycle stealing, so what's so bad about that? But it was wonderful how the right choice of words can send the adrenaline flowing and all that kind of thing.
Incidentally, Apollo 11 almost didn't land on the moon because something was stealing so many cycles that the computer restarted every time.
Yes, somebody forgot to turn off the rendezvous radar, and so it locked. It was trying to land, which is the time at which the computer would be the busiest. And at the same time, it was locked onto the spacecraft, you know, the command module. So there was all kinds of information, and the computer kept saying, I've got too much to do. I'm starting again. I've got too much to do. I'm starting again. So there were lights flashing, and everybody was having heart attacks, as I recall, except for the astronauts. So did the right thing, ignored the computer, went right down. I think this one is yours, Albert, right? Yeah.
This is the point at which we say that very fortunately we were backed up by a tremendous group of engineers. I'm glad to see one of them here today from Raytheon, Barry Dutcher, who I was going to mention as having saved many otherwise disastrous circuit designs by his backup and engineering. This was also true in the mechanical area. Bard Turner I see here today also, which is a pleasure. And some of the people who really did incredible things in those days. There was one little tiny base that we didn't cover, all of our good engineering. And the way we found out about it was that Block 1 computers were being tested in an integration laboratory together with inertial measurement units and sextants and all of that. A computer with a raised floor with air conditioning like computer rooms are built today, with all kinds of very expensive ground test equipment lining the walls. It was a very space-age room. And we found out that the computer, the Apollo guidance computer, would trip its alarm and go into start again mode. For almost any reason, somebody walking in the room, somebody moving a chair, that really had us puzzled. We noticed that if everybody stood stock still, that the computer would work okay. As soon as somebody started moving around, it would go down. We had a lot of trouble with that. Well, it turned out that if you move a chair on one of these raised floors for a few feet, a metal chair, by the way, you move the metal chair somewhere, and it happens to come close to another metal chair, you get a tiny little spark, almost imperceptible, that moves between those two. And a tiny little spark acts just like a radio transmitter, and the computer was sitting there acting like an antenna, acting like a goldstone dish picking up sparks. And it proved to be extremely, so we got to the point where we showed how we could stand across the room and rub things together and touch and make the computer die. So the computer had to be completely re-engineered at that point. Well, not completely because it was too late, but patches had to be put on it. Fortunately, we were making the transition from Block 1 to Block 1B, and at that time we put some additional filters and this and that, and the computer got to be pretty good. And this was about the time we were starting to design the Block 2 computer, and we said, there's one thing that this computer is not going to be, and it's not going to be sensitive to sparks. So, with Eldon's connivance, we were the only piece of equipment on the spacecraft that violated the rule that says that you don't tie the circuit ground to the equipment ground. We did it. We also did all the other things that you're not supposed to do. Those of you who have heard people say you shouldn't ground circuits in more than one place because it makes ground loops, we completely ignored it. We grounded everything everywhere we possibly could. The result was that we were able to take a spark coil and a battery and a buzzer and hook up a gizmo that would draw sparks about 1.5 inches long, and we drew it off the case of the computer and all of its cables and ran that all around the room, and the computer worked just fine. So maybe we overreacted a little bit, but I think we had the most spark-resistant computer ever built. Shall I cover this?
Please go ahead.
We were really hurt by this Belcom assertion that we were cycle stealing, even though it turned out later they were just using a standard computer science word that we hadn't known about. But we were irritated at them. So when we found out that we could draw sparks off our computer, we called them, actually it was not them. We kind of tend to confuse Belcom with IBM there, because Belcom is promoting the IBM Saturn V launch vehicle digital computer, which was a triple modular computer in place of ours. So Ramon called up somebody,
Yeah.
Called IBM and said, how about if we bring our spark coil down and test out your computer and see if it's resistant to sparks as ours?
Well, I'll add one thing, and that's that. First, I asked whether they had any sensitivity to static, and no, don't have any problems. Do you mind if I bring my Ford coil and I spark it? There was another side to this. I thought I'd experiment with that first, and I went down to the central computer, the one normally used, nothing to do with a flight computer. It was a Honeywell 800 at the time, an 1800. And I forget who I asked, a man called Dick Russell or somebody like that, whether it was okay if I went and sparked that machine to see if it failed or not. And I got the usual, you must be kidding kind of a treatment. But it turned out to be the kind of problem that everybody had and nobody admitted. And that was kind of interesting. So.
Well, I mentioned that we were doing active design work between Block 1 and Block 2. And we realized that we had the potential opportunity to make some accommodating changes. One of these, we could have changed the word length from 15 bits. We realized at the time, by this time we knew that we were going to 36,000 words of memory, and thinking, well, that'll surely be enough. 24,000 was just a little bit shy. 36 will absolutely cover it. But even so, we needed a longer word now because we had more instructions and more memory to address and so on. But on consideration, we decided no, because if we change the word length, that will make all of the ground support equipment, very expensive ground test consoles that had been made for Block 1, would make them obsolete, and they would all have to be designed and built all over again. So we decided, all right, we'll keep 15 bits, and so we did. We kept 15 bits into Block 2, and the ground support equipment was all redesigned. Anyway. We finally got up in the air. The computer finally was launched on a manned flight, and this happened to be Apollo 7. Molly Schirra was the commanding officer on that flight. And after he'd been up a day or so, we got urgent word that the computer had malfunctioned badly, and it caused some thousands of restarts before the people on the ground were able to radio up the procedure by which they could inhibit the restart activity. And it turned out it happened when Schirra was testing out some navigation routines. And with the navigation, what you did was to get the sextant lined up with a star, and you do your thing. You pick a star, and the computer program had a number of stars that you could pick from. He picked from star 0. It turned out that the table began with star 1. That's software. Incidentally, you know, don't think it's accidental that we haven't said anything about software. We've chosen as our final slide here, finally, what was tremendously gratifying. As you can imagine, having the opportunity to work on a computer like this was a once in many lifetimes opportunity, and one that we appreciated all the time. I think we probably paid our dues for it in terms of days, nights, and weekends, but at any rate, it was a tremendous opportunity. And it was made sweeter by this little event on Apollo 8, which was the first manned flight that circled the moon. It didn't land. It was Borman, Lovell, and Anders who went up, and around Christmas time, I believe, they got into orbit around the moon, and they went around for a day or two, and then they came back to Earth and had a landing. And there was a television, one of these television broadcasts coming from the spacecraft after they had injected towards the Earth, and they were relaxing, and the tricky parts of the mission were over, except for the re-entry, and they weren't terribly worried about that. And anyway, it wasn't going to happen for a day and a half. So Frank Borman was telling the world about the various pieces of equipment in the spacecraft, and he took the occasion to say, gee, this this little computer here. Boy, you'd be surprised at all the things. That practically does our job for us. Man, it's wonderful. It just makes our job easy. It's a remarkable little machine. Thank you. As a postlude, the Raytheon Apollo guidance computer tape is there. We're going to turn it on and play it. Any of you would like to stay around and watch it are welcome to do so. We probably are going to go and have a glass of cider ourselves.
Thank you. How does one turn it on?
This is on.